All right, so welcome to our new session. I'm gonna start right now in a few minutes. I think, Hany, you should start because my computer is hanged. It's so crazy. Sorry about it. And I can continue later.
Okay. Welcome everyone
like this technology.
for the session number 5 today. Today we have Professor Christopher Livanos. He's a professor of comparative literature at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He is the author of numerous articles on interfaith relations as represented in literatures of the medieval Mediterranean. He has published Greek tradition and Latin influence in the work of George Charleroi with Georgia's Press, 2006, and with Flores Bernard, the poems of John Marbos and Christopher of Mytilene with Harvard University Press in 2018. He's currently translating the pre-Islamic Arabic odes in collaboration with Professor Muhammad Salama of San Francisco State University. And the floor is yours, Professor Chris, and we are really happy to have you.
Thank you very much, Hany, and thank you to the organizers. Let me begin by going in here and share. Let me just share my screen here so that I guess I'm just I don't know.
It's technology. Like
yes,
crazy.
I'm trying to share my screen, and if it doesn't work, it's honestly not that important because my presentation today is not heavily PowerPoint dependent.
But I think you can share. You can share now. Can you please?
Okay. Well, I'm hitting share. So yes, Microsoft PowerPoint is what I would very much like to do.
Yeah. That's great.
It's honestly, okay, it's telling me I have to go into my system preferences, and honestly, my presentation is not such that the PowerPoint's really going to make or break it. So how about if I just go?
Yeah, brilliant.
Because if I go into my system preferences, that could take half an hour. So, and I think I can just read the quotes. And I had some Latin that I was going to show you on a PowerPoint. So if anybody wants to see the Latin, I'd be happy to send it to you. I have been working on some Latin translations of the Qur'an to kind of see how some of the misreadings of the Qur'an and misunderstandings of Islam that continue to prevail in the West had their origins in Latin readings of the Qur'an and in Christian controversies that actually predate Islam. Well, how can problems with Islam, problems Western readers have with Islam predate Islam? Well, I hope to go someplace towards that. So in my presentation today, I'll just read my English translations where relevant. And if anybody would like to see the Latin, I'd be happy to send it to you. The contemporary trend of seeking Christian influence in the Qur'an originates in Christian heresiological methods that predate Islam. The Western Academy's ongoing failure to reckon adequately with its origin as an instrument of religious polemic continues to hinder understanding of the Qur'an. Western Quranic scholarship from the earliest days has viewed the Qur'an as a text that competes with, engages with, and to some extent distorts the Bible. I will apply Harold Bloom's notion of the anxiety of influence not only to Bloom's own reading of the Qur'an, but to the majority of Western Quranic scholarship. Bloom's notion of the strong misreading is problematic at best as an approach to Quranic scholarship, but Bloom's theory is useful because the Gnostic controversy that informs his methods likewise laid the groundwork for all subsequent Western engagement with other religions. So if you're wondering why you're talking about the Qur'an and talking about Harold Bloom, well, part of the answer is that, I mean, Bloom, so much of Bloom's work engages with Gnostic Christianity, and he did write an article on the Prophet Muhammad. Therefore, I do think that he had some insights that can be of value. And likewise, reading Gnosticism and earlier Christian, heterodoxy into the Quran from the earliest times is part of where problems arose. The Western University as an institution was founded to promote Christian doctrine and equip Christian theologians with the apologetic tools that combat their heretical or non-Christian opponents. It should be evident, therefore, that Quranic studies in the Western Academy will continue to repeat the errors of earlier generations unless and until it systematically addresses the legacy of its origins as a heresy-hunting, heathen-fighting institution. Other disciplines have undertaken similar reckonings. An introductory course in English literature or anthropology will typically address how these disciplines have been products and tools of colonial endeavors. Again, I should say maybe this is where someone might say my reference to Harold Bloom becomes problematic because he was exactly the kind of scholar who resisted kicking and screaming precisely the type of reckoning that took place in English literature and that I'm saying needs to take place in other disciplines. But anyway, okay. No such reckoning has taken place in Quranic studies, and much of the field therefore remains preoccupied with the quest for biblical parallels, which in many cases simply do not exist. It's important to stress that the Quran does not contain a single quotation from the Bible. Attempts to argue the contrary rest on finding a phrase like, God made the heavens and the earth, which is too brief and too central to any sort of monotheism to prove anything. So what accounts for an academic milieu in which lengthy monographs finding imagined parallels between the Bible and the Quran continue to appear, and in which the Syriac turn, essentially a search for Christian influences on the Quran, is one of the major schools of thought in the field? To answer this question, we must look back before the Quran itself to the apologetic techniques of the Christian fathers, and then look on to the medieval polemicists who followed them. Consider the words of Peter the Venerable, written to Bernard of Clairvaux, accompanying the first complete translation of the Quran into a Western language, which was made by Robert of Kenton in 1143. This is, the one quote where, I think a slide would have really been helpful, but it's the only one. And as I said, I think I can do without the PowerPoint. So if you want to pretend there was a slide and really be paying attention to the words, this is the time to do it. I invite the reader to bear in mind that these words, which I'm about to read, were delivered with the first Western Quran translation, and to consider the impact they had on subsequent Western views of Islam. So this is my translation of Peter the Venerable's letter to Bernard of Clairvaux, which accompanied a Latin translation of the Quran, which Peter the Venerable commissioned, and in it he spells out very, very clear instructions on how to approach this material. So we're looking at something which was seminal in the history of Western engagement with the Quran, and Peter spells out the methodology that he wants to use, that he tells, another extremely influential Christian churchman, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, how to engage. And let's pay attention to the methodology he outlines. I therefore recommend to you all of the fathers, especially Father Augustine. So Augustine of Hippo died well over a century before the Prophet Muhammad was born. Okay, especially Father Augustine. He was unable to convert Julian the Pelagian or Faustus the Manichaean. So here Peter talks about Augustine of Hippo's controversies with Christian heretical sects. So of course, sects that Peter, Bernard, and Augustine all viewed as heretical. By his words and his labor to the right faith, but nonetheless, he did not shirk from composing great volumes against their errors. He did the same. So we might be wondering, so the way to address this different religion is by looking at intra-Christian controversies that took place over a century before. So he goes on then to say something about, well, how Augustine addressed people of other religions. He did the same against the other heresies of his time and of other times as well. This is Peter talking to Bernard again, as well as against the Jews and the pagans. Thus, he not only armed those of his time, but even transmitted a spiritual gift of greatest edification and instruction to us. So the way Augustine talked in the year 400 to Manichaeans is a gift of greatest edification to us in 1144 as we attempt to address Islam. Okay. To us and to all who follow, which is where it becomes especially problematic, because I see that following continuing without enough self-reflection. The passage I just quoted spells out explicitly that from the very start, Western academic engagement with Islam held up as its primary model who died almost a century and a half before the Prophet Muhammad was born. While Peter recognizes Augustine's apologetic work against Jews and pagans, the overwhelming majority of Augustine's apologetic opus is directed against sects that identified as Christian, and specifically naming Augustine as the model par excellence to imitate. And so, as it's well known, medieval Christian readers would make the mistake of viewing Islam as some sort of a Christian heresy. Where does that come from? Okay. In specifically naming Augustine as the model par excellence to imitate in refuting heresies, including Islam, from Peter's perspective, Peter set in motion an exegetical machine that ever since has looked to any given passage in the Qur'an, primarily with an eye toward finding what part of the Bible has been distorted. We should draw particular attention to Peter the Venerable's admonition that Augustine's work was a spiritual gift of greatest edification and instruction to us and all who follow. Peter's biases made him distinctly unequipped to address a religion which acknowledges many of Christianity's prophets, perhaps even all of them, one might argue, but none of its scriptures. No such religion had existed before Islam, and Islam was thus represented from the outset as something it was not. If we contrast Christian-Muslim dialogue with the Catholic-Manichaean dialogue to which Peter refers, we find a very different dynamic. Augustine and his Manichaean opponents each considered themselves to be the true Christians and the other to be part of a sect that had perverted Christianity. The debates often center on contradictory readings of Paul, a scriptural authority recognized by both Manichaeans and Catholics. Manichaeans did not recognize most of the Bible, and they had a great deal of scriptures unique to their faith that have since been lost, but Paul was a source the two sides could agree on. To a medieval Catholic reader just learning about Islam, but familiar with the anti-Manichaean writings of the Church Fathers, it might have seemed that Manichaeism had much in common with Islam. Manichaeism claimed to be a scripturally based religion revealed to an inspired prophet whose predecessors had included Zarathustra and Jesus. Islam's emphasis on revealed scripture and a succession of prophets would have struck the Western medieval Christian as similar to well-known features of Manichaeism. When applied to Islam, however, a neo-Augustinian apologetic methodology of the sort Peter the Venerable suggests can only be self-referential, failing to address Islam on terms that make sense to Muslims. This is the case because Islam, unlike the Christian heresies Augustine addressed, does not share any scriptures in common with Christianity or Judaism. Peter's mention of Augustine's Jewish and pagan opponents is noteworthy. It seems as though he understood that Islam is not a Christian heresy, but a distinct religion, yet was compelled by over-reliance on patristic texts to overlook this important fact. So the listener may now be wondering what any of this has to do with Harold Bloom. First of all, I should mention Manichaeism is often regarded as a form of Gnosticism. And my answer is partly that Bloom's fascination with Gnosticism makes him a relevant point of reference in discussing the Christian polemicists who viewed the Qur'an through the prism of Gnosticism, as did Peter the Venerable, Bernard of Clairvaux, and practically everyone. Another reason I've chosen to engage here with Bloom's work is that while he at times exemplifies the problem I'm concerned with, namely the reading of biblical references into the Qur'an, he at times offers a way out of this conundrum. So I'll give another quote. This is from Harold Bloom's book, Genius, in which he includes essays on 100 people he considers literary geniuses, one of them being the Prophet Muhammad. So Bloom talking here, some scholars who ought to know better still refer to the Quran as a barbarized version of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. In a good translation, and of course Bloom relied on translation, like that of Ahmed Ali, the Quran is very much its own book. Okay, I mean, so far so good from, I mean, my point of view as someone simply trying to understand the text. Then he goes on to say, continuing, which, so very much its own book, fit rival, this is where it comes problematic, fit rival to the strong scriptures that it knowingly comes after and strikingly reinterprets. And I quote that because it just seems an example of a place where the second half of Bloom's statement seems to exemplify the error he condemns in the first. To continue again, partly why.
2 minutes, Chris.
Yes.
Yeah, 2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Okay. So continuing, Bloom says, for me, the Quran has a particular fascination because it is the largest instance I know of what during the last quarter century I have been calling the anxiety of influence. 2 minutes. I was watching my clock here pretty closely and I thought I had 5, but if I need to wrap it up sooner than that, I can do that. So how much is it? Two or
let's see 3 minutes.
Okay, okay. So I'll see what I can do. I was timing it for 5, and I even took my clock off the shelf and put it right here. But okay, so and then I'm going to go ahead and read a little bit more and say that the Quran has, now again for Bloom, looking at the Quran. And after a lifetime of reflection on Gnostic scriptures, which were always one of his great preoccupations, Bloom says, so the Quran has little in common with the Talmud, but as an interpretation of the Hebrew patriarchs and prophets, it seems to me highly persuasive. Finally, one more, I'm going to quote one more thing from Bloom and then, try to wrap up. So bearing in mind what he just said, little in common with the Talmud, but a persuasive interpretation of the Hebrew patriarchs and prophets. Okay, so what he's saying about the Quran. And then Muhammad's struggle, this is Bloom talking, rarely involves any direct confrontation with the text of Torah or gospel. Perhaps he shied away from it, or more likely he just did not know it. He knew rabbinical traditions, oral and written, which were all he needed or wanted, and these came to him and left him in the heights. So I find this, very much in some ways self-contradictory attitude towards the Quran, where he says, well, he knows the rabbinical traditions, and then in the other places we said, okay, but he has little in common with the rabbinical traditions. So which is it? But okay, now I'm really going to wrap up. The notion of the Quran as a misreading of the Bible predates Bloom by centuries, originating in controversies surrounding the Gnostic writers who preoccupied both Bloom and the Christian heresiologists. To Bloom's credit, though, the notion of literature being influenced by, shaped by something else is perhaps less problematic, because in his view, the struggle with an author's influence is the very essence of creativity. The Bible-centered approach to the Quran has been overemphasized and too often applied in a way that fails to do justice to the originality of the Quran. Whatever the validity of Bloom's projection of the anxiety of influence onto all of literature, Bloom did perhaps have a compelling reading of the Gnostic scriptures that inspired his theory. Of all the famous literary critics, Bloom is without question the one most interested in the Gnostic scriptures that Western readers have counted among the Quran's sources, and to his credit, he does not argue for a Gnostic imprint on the Quran. However, Western Quranic studies has long gone astray in assuming that the level of biblical engagement found in Gnostic texts is likewise present in the Quran. In order to recognize Islam on its own terms, the West must adopt new approaches to the literary and religious significance of the Quran. Okay. So I think that, thank you very much. And
thank you so much for your great presentation. I guess I got my energy back now with your presentation. Thank you so much. So we go to the next speaker, who is Colinda Lindermann. Colinda Lindermann is a graduate of Larsen University and Freie Universitat Berlin, is a PhD candidate in the research group Arabic Philology and Textual Practices in the Early Modern Period, 1500 to 1800 at Freie Universitat Berlin. She's currently working as a research associate in the DFG project Orient Digital at the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin. Since 2020, Colinda is the managing editor of the journal Philological Encounters. So the floor is yours, Colinda.
Thank you very much, Nasim, for the introduction. Thank you very much to the organizers for hosting this wonderful conference, and thanks to all the speakers for such inspiring papers so far. From the early days of Arabic grammar and lexicography onward, Arabic language scholars were interested in the issue of loanwords. Besides identifying loanwords in the Arabic language, most prominently in the Qur'an, and collecting them in word lists or treatises, they also engaged with the theoretical framework of taʿrīb, what in modern linguistic terms would be called loanword adaptation, and is often translated as Arabicization, the process that turns a foreign word into an Arabic word. In modern linguistics, the study of loanwords or lexical borrowings is considered important for our understanding of the grammatical structure of language and the theory of language change in historical linguistics. The oldest borrowings are most likely cultural borrowings, which use a foreign word for a concept or object that was not previously known in the recipient language. This, in fact, is the case of many Persian words that refer to fabrics, like ibrisam, silk, food items, sanjabil, ginger, or plants, nilufar, water lily. Early debates on loanwords in the Arabic linguistic tradition revolve around the question whether there can be non-Arabic words in the Qur'an, seeing as God himself has described the book as an Arabic Qur'an. A consensus on this problem was reached with Abu Ubaid, who is reported to have said that these Quranic words may be of foreign origin, asl, but that their current state is Arabic. This statement is reported by Abu Mansur al-Jawaliqi, a lexicographer from the 12th century who wrote the first loanword dictionary, Al-Mu'arab min al-Kalam al-Ajami ala huruf al-Mu'ajam. Up until then, there had been shorter treatises restricted to loanwords in the Qur'an and discussion of loanwords in the comprehensive dictionaries such as Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad's Kitab al-Ain, Ibn Durayj's Jamharat al-Lura, and Al-Jawhari's Taj al-Lugha wa Sihah al-Arabiya. Al-Jawhari was also the one who gave a most simple and often cited definition of taʿrīb. تعريب الاسم العجمي أن تتفوه به العرب على منهاجها. تعريب of the foreign word means that the Arabs pronounced or uttered it according to their own manner. In this presentation, I will give a short overview of Arabic loanword theory prior to the Ottoman period, and then discuss its treatment among 16th and 17th century scholars of the Arabic language, to show how the multilingual Ottoman environment propelled the interest in and engagement with Arabic loanwords. Taʿrīb is synonymous with i'rāb, a concept that is familiar to us as desinential inflection. Both literally mean to make something Arabic. The inflectional endings distinguish an Arabic word from a non-Arabic word. The term taʿrīb is used for different types of loanword adaptation. Sibawayh mentioned several processes to render a word Arabic. I have highlighted the relevant terms in blue. Sometimes they changed its state from its state in the foreign language by appending to the Arabic the non-Arabic letters. And they exchanged the position of the letter that is Arabic to the Arabs for another, and changed the voweling and the position of the augment. And they did that by appending to their patterns or by not appending, through change, substitution, augmentation, and deletion, when change was necessary, and sometimes they left the noun as it was if its letters were also their letters. And sometimes, whether it fitted their pattern or not. And sometimes they changed the letter that was not among their letters and did not change it with respect to its pattern in Persian. So taʿrīb firstly entails taghyir of letters in case the original letters are not part of the Arabic alphabet. And secondly, it may or may not entail ilhaq, a concept that was translated as appending, changing the original form of a word to adapt it to Arabic patterns. As one of the examples Sibawayh uses in an earlier passage says, the loanword dirham is appended to the genuinely Arabic word hijra'a, meaning tall or lean of hunting dogs, or put in a more abstract way to the pattern fi'lal. In Sibawayh's description, the term ibdal, designates the substitution of one letter for another. Further on, he will explain that ibdal is necessary for Persian letters that are not part of the Arabic alphabet, but that there are no strict one-on-one rules. Persian che, for instance, which is circumscribed by Sibawayh as the letter that is between kaf and jim, could turn into jim, but also into qaf. A point I wish to stress in this quotation is the fact that the process of i'rab or taʿrīb is presented as something that happened in the past, as an act that was carried out and completed by them, the Arabs of old, the ancients, also mentioned by Simon Lees yesterday. And now the bab of taʿrīb is closed, so to speak. This is in line with the idea that the corpus of utterances that constitutes correct Arabic in grammar and lexicography is limited to kalam al-Arab, the speech of the Bedouins roughly up to the end of the Umayyad period, the Qur'an, and to a more limited and contested extent also hadith. In line with this, Arabic language scholars distinguished between mu'arab, a loan word or literally an Arabicized word, and muwallad. The term muwallad, which literally means half-breed or of mixed descent, is used for neologisms, words that were coined by the moderns, muhtathun, that is, authors from the Abbasid period onward. Why would we even bother to learn whether a word is a loan word or not? As Arab grammarians, for example, Ibn al-Sarraj in his Risala fil Ishtiqaq, and most famously Ibn Faris in his Maqayis al-Lugha, assumed that words from the same root also had a related meaning, it was important to distinguish foreign words, to avoid the erroneous claim that the bird is the offspring of the fish, as Ibn al-Sarraj put it in the 10th century. Ishtiqaq means to build forms on the basis of existing roots and patterns, a virtue of the Arabic language. Listing loanwords helped to safeguard the Arabic language from incorrect derivation. But if the letters of the word and the word pattern can be changed to adapt them to the Arabic language, how can we even know if a word is a loanword? The answer is through its transmission by A'immat al-Lugha, the language professionals. In his Handbook of Linguistics, Al-Mushir fi Ulum al-Lugha wa Anwa'iha, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti details the means of recognizing a foreign word. So he says, قال أئمة العربية تعرف عجمة الاسم بوجوه, and then he states the different wujuh. And the first one is its transmission by one of the Arabic language specialists. The second one is its deviation from the measures of the Arabic noun, such as ibrisam, as the model for this measure is not present in the Arabic nominal patterns. The third is the first letter is noon followed by ra, as in narjis, as this does not occur in an Arabic word. So the first criterion is transmission by a language expert. The remaining criteria, as Suyuti mentioned 7, are morphological, like the second, or phonological, like the third. They pertain to letter combinations that do not exist in the Arabic lexicon. The phonological principles are, in turn, taken from the introduction to Al-Jawaliqi's loanword dictionary, which contains more principles to help identify loanwords on the basis of letter combinations, such as the statement that jim and qaf cannot occur together in a genuinely Arabic word. Funny that his own name, Al-Jawaliqi, contains exactly this combination. And this, by the way, is a fact that was not mentioned by Al-Jawaliqi himself, but added 5 centuries later by another scholar of loanwords, Shihabuddin al-Khafaji. Possibly the first treatise entirely devoted to loanword theory, without containing a dictionary proper, was written by Shamsuddin Ahmad ibn Kemal Pasha, better known by his Turkish name Kemal Pasha Zade. This scholar and Sheikh al-Islam wrote in Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, in the fields of history, jurisprudence, and linguistics, among other things. One example of his keen interest in the intricacies of correct Arabic is his treatise on speech errors, At-Tanbih ala Ghalat al-Jahil wal-Nabih. We will see how speech errors relate to loanwords later. In his treatise on loanwords, Risala fi Tahqiq taʿrīb al-Kalima al-Ajamiyya, Kemal Pasha Zade sets out his own version of Arabic loanword theory. The word tahqiq in the title points to the objective of verifying existing theory. In the introduction, he adds to that he wishes to detail, tafsil, its parts and distinguish, tamyiz, between what belongs to it and what does not. And he carries out exactly what he promises. Should the summary of the theory I gave you at the outset of this presentation have left you slightly puzzled, don't worry, Kemal Pashazadeh comes to the rescue. His account of taʿrīb is more detailed and more comprehensive than that of authors before him. What had been subsumed by Sibawayh and al-Jawaliqi under taghyir, Kemal Pashazadeh terms tasarruf, free disposal or adoption. While the tradition had used a tripartite division, Kemal Pashazadeh lists 4 types of loanword adaptation. So logically, this is when there's no taghyir and no ilhaq, when there's change, when there's no change but there is appending, when there's change and no appending, and when there's change and appending. And he lists the classical examples for that, which are the stock examples found in Sibawayh and other authors. But Kemal Pashazadeh gives us more details. For instance, he explains that it's permissible to expand the meaning of a word after Arabicization, and this does not alter its status as a Mu'arab. In other words, he speaks of semantical adaptation. He says, after Arabicization, the foreign word may be assigned a different meaning than the original word, the original meaning. This does not contradict its loanword nature with respect to the first meaning. The remainder of the treatise serves to discuss examples of Mu'arabat, and this is where the urgency of the matter, or what Yassir Suleiman has termed language anxiety, comes into play. As in his treatise on speech errors, Kemal Pashazadeh wishes to instruct his readers on linguistic issues that had been transmitted for centuries by updating them for a contemporary audience. For instance, by adding Persian verses as probative quotations, or by suggesting some new etymology from Turkish. By building on classical examples from Sibawayh, but also on Al-Hariri's treatise on speech errors, Durat al-Ghawaz fi Awham al-Khawaz, which was an extremely popular text to engage with during the early modern period, Kemal Pashazadeh provided an overview of debates in the field of loanwords that could serve any learned discussion. That the topic of taʿrīb was en vogue among the Ottomans is not only testified by this work of Kemal Pashazadeh. Roughly half a century later, Muhammad ibn Badruddin al-Akhizari al-Munshi, more famous as a scholar of tafsir, wrote a treatise on loanwords, heavily borrowing from Kemal Pashazadeh, but also adding a personal note. The text contains a theoretical introduction, setting out 7 criteria for determining whether a word is Mu'arab. It is, in fact, the list that was also given by As-Suyuti. The body of the text consists of an alphabetical list of loanwords, which he all terms Mu'arab, including words from the Qur'an, but also from other and later contexts, such as astrolab, and al-Ifranja, the Franks. Among the authorities mentioned are the classics of Arabic linguistics, such as Ibn Qutayba, al-Tha'alibi, al-Jawhari, al-Jawaliqi, al-Firuzabadi, and As-Suyuti. In most entries, al-Munshi gives a short definition, followed by the source language or the original word the loanword derives from. Previously, consistently providing definitions was a rather uncommon feature of loanword dictionaries, as definitions of well-known words were not considered necessary. But al-Munshi is consistent in this approach. Even the word as-sukar, sugar, is explained as that which is gathered from cane juice. The great detail of the author's explanation of loanwords is illustrated by the example of Faylasuf. Al-Faylasuf, lover of wisdom, Arabicized from Filasufa, and Fila or Fayla means the lover, and Sufa is wisdom. And from this, al-falsafa is derived, just as a sophista is derived from sufista, meaning vain wisdom, sophistry. And from this comes ista in Turkish. I'm not sure if he means the Turkish verb istemek here or something else, but it is worth noting that even the second largest dictionary in Arabic language history, Lisan al-Arab, does not sport such an elaborate definition of falsafa. We move forward 1 century. The 17th century Egyptian scholar Shihabuddin al-Khafaji produced a loanword dictionary that is at first glance close to al-Jawaliqi's al-Mu'arab. This work, titled Shifa al-Ghalil Fima fi Kalam al-Arab min al-Dakhil, starts with a theoretical introduction based on the rules set out by al-Jawaliqi, garnered with examples from poetry, also contemporary poetry, even his own poetry, and expanded with principles from a wide array of other sources. This approach tells us that al-Khafaji, like Kemal Pashazadeh, found it important to explain loanword theory to his contemporary audience. But as is clear from the fact that he cites Mehtap poets, he takes the concept of loanwords, or the term he uses in his title, dakhil, words that have entered, one step further. He deliberately also includes muwallad and instances of dialect, sociolect, and solecism, lahn al-amma, of which some are criticized as incorrect, but many are also listed in a neutral manner. Keeping in mind the keynote lecture of Professor Keshavas yesterday, we need not stress the fact that Arabic loanword theory was already highly developed by the 8th century. I have tried to highlight the subsequent engagement with and adaptation of the conceptual framework of taʿrīb to the needs and interests of a pre-modern audience, specifically in the trilingual Ottoman environment. The foundation laid by Sibawayh and his contemporaries remained valid, but was expanded and cultivated. The fact that the language professionals, a'immat al-lugha, were regarded as the transmitters and guardians of this tradition made this engagement also into a matter of prestige, of which the practical function was, however, never disregarded. Authors living in a multilingual environment were willing and able to update the information provided by older authorities, while inscribing themselves into the tradition. If we followed this line into the 19th and 20th century, we could even add to this overview the endeavors of the Arabic language academies in laying down principles of taʿrīb for modern scientific terminology. They too build on a conceptual framework that was laid down over a millennium. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colinda. It was a very interesting presentation, and I hope we get to read it later as a published work. So we move to the next speaker today, which is the last speaker of this panel, Mehtap Ozdemir, who will be talking about debating Balaghat, the poetics of affiliative translation in late Ottoman literary modernity. Mehtap is a PhD candidate in comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her dissertation, The Ethos of World Literature, Timely Translations and Moral Modernity in Late Ottoman Literary Culture, documents the relationship between conceptual history and literary modernity by tracing the transnational journey of the Islamic adab culture in Ottoman letters from 1850s to 1940s. In addition to a forthcoming article in the interdisciplinary volume, Critical Global Studies Beyond Eurocentrism, she's currently co-editing with Alexander Jabbari and Mariam Fatima a special issue for philological encounters under the title of The Late Persianate World, Transregional Comparisons and the Question of Language. That's amazing. So welcome, Mehtap, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nasim, for the introduction. And before I start, I would like to express my thanks to the organizers, but in particular to Hany Rashwan for encouraging me to, submit my abstract in the first place, because, honestly, the title pre-modern, set me off a little bit in the beginning. And I'm working on what we call the modern time, although we work against sort of challenging the divisions still, they are there. So
I understand that was a big challenge for me too, but I'm really glad I'm doing it because I come from a women, gender and sexuality studies background and anthropology. So I guess I can do a lot now I know. Thank you so much. So Mehtap, I'm also glad you're working with Alexander Jabbari. Yeah. He's from Oxford. That's amazing. So congratulations for your new collaboration. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah. So the paper I'm presenting today, it's called from a longer chapter that takes up the questions of literacy, literary criticism, and language ideology in reference to a series of polemical debates on Balaghat in 1880s. At the center of these debates was a textbook, Talim-i Edebiyat, the Teaching of Literature, which reformist intellectual poet and translator Recaizade Ekrem wrote to teach Ottoman literature at the Royal School of Civil Service. And the textbooks publications spurred 2 rounds of polemics that lasted almost 3 months in 1882 and 5 months in 1886. On the other side of these polemics was Haji Ibrahim Effendi, who was already known to the public by his involvement in an earlier debate that was also sparked by another text on Belagat Osmaniye, which Cevdet Pasha had written while teaching at Mehtap Hukuk. So what is at display in these consecutive debates that involved, many more names, but I am only focusing on the interaction between Ekrem and Haji Ibrahim here. What we see is this sort of polyphonic process of judgment on the subject and object of literary knowledge to differentiate literacy from literariness and to differentiate, men of letters from teachers in general. So what I'll try to do here is to give you an idea about the main issues raised by these debates and suggest how we sort of can read the period differently a little bit. And to get us started a little bit, just to contextualize Ekrem's work. So in current literary historiography, Ekrem's textbook is taken as the foundational step in theorizing modern Turkish literature. According to Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, the textbook heralds the independence of Turkish literature from Arabic poetics. As he puts it, it marks quote, our first confrontation with Bedi, Beyan, and Belagat of Arabs, end quote. So for sure, to a certain extent, the textbook suggests the displacement of the Belagat tradition, for it wasn't modeled on the established references of the Belagat tradition, but rather drew on French sources. And content-wise, certain categories like taste, memory, and genius were reintroduced as analytical terms, while linguistic devices were understated to put more emphasis on the communicative function of literary writing. It, however, did so under the sign of edebiyat, which was far from having a fixed and determined meaning in 1880s. In those times, Ahmet Rasim, for instance, noted in his memoirs of high school years, edebiyat was a new word, and its more established counterpart was kitabat, end quote. In that sense, there was not a clear break between literacy or literariness or general writing. And offered in the 3rd year of secondary education, Ekrem's course, Edebiyat Osmaniye, was not designed to teach the rudimentaries of grammar and composition, but to introduce students to the components of literary writing that would include meaning, style, figural language, and language arts. These are the section titles of the textbook. So by foregrounding notions like ideas, sentiment, taste, imagination, sensibility, and memory at the expense of the conventional division of the science of eloquence, and carrying the term edebiyat to its title, Ekrem's coursebook claimed to initiate a break between in a literary theory. It was an attempt, however, which had to contend with the state of confusion that characterized literary studies in the late Ottoman context, because from the very start, the book targeted, how literature was not defined, clearly defined in some available textbooks. For instance, the Ekrem criticized the current usages of the term for being imprecise, incomplete, and controversial. His main objection was directed against its inconsistent treatment, either under the rubric of linguistic sciences, which would include fields like grammar or lexicography, or be treated as an autonomous fen that would still require expertise in subfields as grammar or etymology or prosody. For him, these available textbooks drew on the linguistic norms of Arabic to theorize the grounds of Ottoman literary writing by turning a blind eye to contemporary works. His position on this was very clear. Ottoman, as he said it, Ottoman is not Arabic. So it is to this end, he defined literature by first defining who an edip is. So according to him, an edip must know for sure linguistic rules like concerning meaning, elucidation, and rhetorical figures, and be well-versed in prosody. But more than that, he said, he should acquire certain methods and styles operant as norms and rules in current literary works. So it is not too far-fetched to assume that it was Ekrem and his like-minded reformist writers who embodied the proper attributes of literary learnedness that required refined taste, poetic genius, and imaginative sensibility. Despite its ambiguousness, ambiguity and vagueness, Ekrem's theory struck, however, a chord with the next generation that gathered around the Servet-i Fünun journal, where the categories of taste, genius, and imagination were theorized under the new discipline of aesthetics. As Hüseyin Cahit, one of the writers, put it, their work only furthered the project initiated by Talim. And the purpose was to compensate for the absence of the fundamental rules of art that gave rise to disagreements on literary style, and the question was more about having taste than having linguistic knowledge. As Ekrem suggested, a critic must possess more than a knowledge of the rules of belagat. Just like an edip, a critic must have natural and learned virtues such as philosophical perspective, poetic disposition, cultured style, power of discernment, refined thinking, and compassionate feelings, among others. So all in all, while the idealization of literature served on the one hand to assert its difference from literacy, it also distinguished men of letters and critics from others literate in languages as such. From this perspective, the increasing identification of literariness with an emergent aesthetic paradigm might explain why Ekrem, for instance, condemned his critics like Hacı İbrahim Efendi as charlatans and argued that they babbled on some superficial remarks like finding a compound incompatible with syntactical rules, showing incoherence between an attributive and its attributed, finding faults with prosody, or just objecting the word choice. Yet when looked deeper, one sees that this discourse was in fact rested on repetition, since Ekrem's course book circulated among students in lithograph format. And it's important to remember that the textbook was progressively delivered in an actual classroom, and it was an oral performance. And the 1879 lithograph edition opens with the eloquent address of esteemed Ekrem Beyefendi, broken up into 3 short segments by a repeated vocative gentleman, perhaps as a sign of good manners and cultivation. Yet the address opened in a self-undermining manner, since Ekrem was concerned about his role, mainly because he wasn't sure if his knowledge and training was adequate to meet the requirements of the current position. But more importantly, his trepidation was due to his awareness that the lecture would be placed under scrutiny by students in terms of its performance in delivering a clear and eloquent talk. The terms he used, fesahat and belagat, the very conceptual tools, the textbook was later interpreted to this place. So while what we see here is his inability to step outside of the language of eloquence, as a public speaker, even for a second, this was not the only time that the definition of literariness largely boiled down to the parameters of fasahat and belagat, or to a balance between semantic clarity and poetic expressiveness. This we see in taǩrīzes or reviews that Ekrem wrote for newly published poetry collections. Even though the emerging aesthetic paradigm tried to pin down literary criticism to one form, the late Ottoman culture of criticism was experienced in diverse modes like public debates, book introductions, textbooks, and reviews. And this diversity found expression in the multiplicity of concepts like mübahese, münakaşa, muhakeme, intikad, or tenkid, all referring to diverse facets of criticism. So what is striking about taǩrīz or review is its function as an important side of literary production that placed the person who wrote it and the person for whom it was written in a mutual relationship authorial endorsement. Moreover, we can trace in these evaluative pieces how Ekrem's critical vocabulary was inflected by a shifting dynamic between fasahat and belagat. Because Ekrem prioritized clarity and correctness of literary expression over its poetic and rhetorical innovativeness. And the background of this choice was the question of the relation between meaning and form that was problematized in the second half of the century, when classical poetry was found too obsessed with language arts and at the expense of meaning. Yet the importance of fasahat to his literary criticism sort of contradicts the way Ekrem dismissed other critics who also focused on correctness and clarity of expression that in his textbook, for example. So among those charlatans who understood criticism as nothing more than lexical analysis was Hacı İbrahim Efendi, who took the faulty and unclear language use of the textbook as an indication for the unsoundness of its ideas. if one reason why Ibrahim Effendi was so aggressive in his critique was Talim's suggestion of realigning Ottoman Turkish with French rather than Arabic, the other reason was his awareness that this emerging literary paradigm denied expertise to a particular body of readership, including Haji Ibrahim, who would prefer traditional textual practices like sharh commentaries without having any taste for contemporary literature. And the reason, Haji Ibrahim Effendi had received a philological training in Arabic language and literature in Hijaz after his primary education at the neighborhood Mehtap and the Beyazıt Mosque in Istanbul. However, like Ekrem, he held various official positions and taught poetics, composition, oration. And he founded the private Arabic school Darut Talim, where he used translation as a pedagogical tool and published on Arabic grammar, syntax, poetics, and elucidation to use as course materials in the school. And furthermore, later in 1887, he was appointed by the Sultan to teach Ekrem's own course at Mekteb-i Mülkiye. So considering how their occupational trajectories orbited around similar institutions, it's no surprise that Haji Ibrahim Effendi was on the front line of an attack against Ekrem or his textbook Talim. And this attack unfolded in a moralizing and gendered language. So when the polemic arose in 1882, the ideological backbone of Ibrahim Effendi's position had already been laid out in previous disputes. To summarily, according to him, Ottoman language perforated by solecisms, mistakes stemming either from an ignorance of Arabic or from imitating French phraseology, stood as a proxy for the empire's frayed social fabric and ruptured cultural corpus. A clear example where the literary was juxtaposed with the moral and the political was a petition that Ibrahim Effendi wrote to the Sultan Abdülhamid II, in which he conveyed a strong critique of Şemseddin Sami's and other reformist articles, which introduced the theory of language families and suggested the purification of Turkish from Arabic. So Sami's rethinking of languages or linguistic relations along scientific lines goes against the way in which Arabic was considered as the house of divine logos in the Ottoman culture of diglossia. So as shown by historians, Ottoman higher eloquent language was fashioned in an intercultural space of translation that selectively kept certain Arabic and Persian words or phrases untranslated in order to refine the Ottoman language. Within this diglossic culture, Arabic was of epistemic and ontological significance by being the language of divine knowledge and existence. So as Nergis Ertürk elaborates, the 19th century idea of language as a transparent medium of communication put a different light on the hybrid nature of Ottoman language and literature, which was either celebrated as a spring of knowledge, for example, by Ziya Pasha, or condemned for being formed of three disparate units, one, for example, Namık Kemal likened to Holy Trinity. And within this context, while Ibrahim Effendi taught Arabic as the language of the Quran and Ottoman Turkish in half symbolic terms due to its kinship with Arabic, Şemseddin Sami put a different spin on the filiative associations of language as divine creation by replacing the religious moral ties with evolutionary relations invoked by the theory of language family. So against the secularizing undertones of Sami's thinking, Ibrahim Effendi resorted to the familiar organic metaphor of the nation, or kavim, as body, that allowed him to articulate the filiative links between Arabic and Ottoman Turkish. What is interesting is the appearance of this metaphor in one of Ibrahim Effendi's etymological analysis, whereby he responded to the much repeated charge of dogmatism or ta'assub on his part. So in the article where he dealt with the accusation of his ignorance, he undertook an etymological deconstruction of muta'assib. He says, quote, "The core of this word is asab. It refers to ligaments that connect joints. It also means bending and binding something firmly. Derived from this root, ta'assub denotes both bodily tissues and social bonds among the individuals of a nation, with the further implication of national attachment and bonding. That's why we are proud of dogmatism," end quote. So it is within this logic that he understood any proposition about the externality of Arabic to Ottoman as an act of self-surgery that would leave behind a dismembered Ottoman body. For him, it was Arabic. For him, Arabic was our lisan al-adab, since Quran was the source of adab. and consequently literary education still carried the meaning of a knowledge of Quranic sciences, and its obtainment required linguistic training in Arabic. So we can say that it is within the moral universe of adab that Ibrahim Effendi disputed Talim's definition of edebiyat. In Ibrahim Effendi's framework, insofar as adab meant verbal and written expressions that concern adab, his idea of learnedness was encapsulated by the idea of mueddib, which was pitted against edib. Since Mueddib was different from any other man of letters because he would possess two kinds of adab. Edebi ders that would manifest in using a language free from solecisms, and edebi nafs that would concern individual morality. That's why his critique sort of combined the linguistic and the moral dimensions of Ekrem's work at the same time. And he was not alone in putting an emphasis on adab to understand an edebiyat. In a similar manner, Hayret Efendi defined edib, another participant in the polemics, Hayret Efendi defined edib as a person who produces eloquent, beligane works such as histories, articles on morality, works of wisdom in prose and poetry, and parables from earlier times, end quote. Seconding Ibrahim Effendi's critique of Ekrem's terms, Hayret Efendi suggested that Ekrem's definition of literature was in fact taken from the definition of balagat in Mutawwal. It was, however, a deformed adaptation since Ekrem confounded knowledge as learned rules with knowledge as embodied faculty. So against the elevation of Ekrem to an authoritative position, thanks to a book written with solecism, Ibrahim Effendi therefore used the notion of ilim as a litmus test to judge the solidity of modern theory. Remarkably, he narrativized this quality check in which the past was invited to comment on the health of the present. In the satirical allegory he concocted, Ekrem's textbook Talim Edebiyat was personified as a man of high position who took on the role of surrogate mother for his children. Among his multiple offspring, it was the mahsul-i efkar, or the product of mind, that the feminized father most doted over and was deaf to those who pointed out the physical and mental weakness of the boy. Unfortunately, this boy was unable to deal with the neighbor's kid named Tabu Selim. It was a notion that Ibrahim Effendi used in the polemics. And this, just personified as the neighbor's boy, this forced the father, Talim, to seek aid. In vain, Ekrem's textbook Talim called for the help of Western sciences, but eventually resorted to Ibn Sina, who examined both kids, finding Tabu Selim sound and healthy, thanks to his pursuit of ilm in Arabic, while diagnosing the product of mind, or Ekrem's Talim, as sick and irrational. You know, the point of the story is quite clear, as is the choice of Ibn Sina, whose case was mirroring, according to Ibrahim Effendi, his desire to progress as a Turk and a Muslim. So in the following commentary on the absurdity of this humorous story, one traces Ibrahim Effendi's own temporal predicament that originated from an illusion of the possibility of identification with a past self, and which resulted in a negative self-knowledge. Neither a display of expertise in linguistic analysis, nor a recourse to the moralizing power of allegory was enough for him to eliminate his image of Haji Baba, who doesn't know what taste, sentiment, and imagination mean. In the eyes of his contenders, he was no more than an aging blind man, ignorant of the widening circle of education. Considering that he faced a major backlash from students throughout, he must have acutely felt the institutional pressure of modern literature endorsed in a widening network, so much so that he pretended having received a supportive letter from an unnamed friend. An interesting aspect of these debates was that when conversations edged on personal insult, there were frequent appeals to the debaters to abide by debate etiquette. While Ekrem early on, for instance, undermined Haji Ibrahim Effendi's authority by suggesting his unfamiliarity with debate etiquette, Ibrahim Effendi later projected this critique back on reformers who were making perfect use of the rules of vilification while being oblivious of the rules of argumentation. Ibrahim Effendi's accusations that targeted moral integrity, faith, and knowledge of the other side were retaliated by a similarly abusive language that called him slanderer, immoral, traitor, hypocrite, and found his total existence pernicious. So it was these accumulating abusive quarrels that called the propriety of literary criticism into question. One offshoot of this demand was an epistolary exchange between Beşir Fuat and Muallim Naci that took place around the same time with these debates on poetics and later published under the title of Intiqad. Here, I won't be going into too much detail about this conversation, but what is interesting is the way these two figures who were somehow forced to occupy two ends of a desired literariness found a common language in debate etiquette. Fuat, for instance, resorted to the terminology of ilm al-munazara when he planned to publish his polemics by dividing into two parts. One is under the title of munazara and the other one is jadal. One immediate source for this vocabulary for someone like Fuat, who was not learned in Arabic or Persian, was Cevdet Pasha's book Adab-ı Sadat, where Pasha explained that in munazara, the logic of reasoning focuses on the process of revealing the truth of a matter, while the sole purpose of Jadal is to conclude a discussion in triumph, regardless of means and rhetoric. So as modern day scholars, how do we recover the truth in this series of debates? I take my cue from the way in which the conversation between Naci and Fuat was left unfinished since Fuat committed suicide soon after. And I suggest focusing more on the process rather than the product, or trying to find a predetermined literary endpoint where modernity should take us. So if the literary was ultimately identified with the modern, the civilized, the educated, all ideological terms, it was through complex and multi-generational disciplinary processes that involved institutions, long debates and texts. And the invocation of debate etiquette alerts us not only to the existence of a cultural space in which literature intersects with social norms and polite manners and carries an moral import, but also to the conceptual and modal diversity of literary criticism in Islamic literatures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mehtap. Very impressive research. So here we have the panel open for questions and comments if anyone wants to comment on one of these presentations. So yes, please raise your hands or unmute yourself.
Thank you, Nasim. I have a question for Colinda, whose slide on Al-Munshi and Al-Khafaji really made my eyes light up. It mentioned on the slide that one of their sources, well, I don't know if they were using it as a source, but Lughat al-Mukhannathin was mentioned, presumably as a muwallad form of discourse, as most of us, I think, know. The Mukhannath was, if you're like a third gender, men who dressed as women is one way to think of it, analogous perhaps to the Hijris of South Asia. And I did something very rude, actually, Colinda, in the middle. I jumped up and Googled the phrase in Arabic because I've never seen it referenced, and I got almost no results. It seems, Colinda, that you have, I know this wasn't the focus of your paper, but do one of these authors talk a lot about Lughat al-Mukhannathin in a way that could be used as a resource for, well, where I'm going with this is that, and Nasim, this speaks to your interests in a big way. If we're trying to recover something like an LGBTQI community or demimonde from the pre-modern period, having access to examples of Mukhannath language, or for lack of a better word, would be invaluable. So very excited now. Now poor Colinda has to race through her notes to find what you may have on Lughat al-Mukhannathin, but I am all ears. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So, yeah, does anyone want to respond to that?
Yes, I can respond to that. Thanks for the question or the comment. I don't want to disappoint you, but this is in fact the only instance I found of this kind of reference. I picked it because it's different from the other references. Usually we know, of course, know works that are specifically devoted, for example, to Lughat al-Atibba, or also Aghlat al-Fuqaha, for example, so works that treat the jargon or the speech errors of a certain group of people. Muhaddathun are also among them. And this is in Al-Khafaji's Shifa al-Ghalil. And it's the only reference to Lughat al-Mukhannathin. And it's not, he doesn't say literally this is Lughat al-Mukhannathin, but he gives a word and says then, well, I can read it to you. It's هرسة بها مفتوحة وراء ساكنة والسين مهملة بمعنى العقل والمخنثون يقولون للأكل هرسة وللشرب مقعة. And then there's a quote from Ibn Rumi where he uses both words, but in the correct form. So the form that is cited by Al-Khafaji is always the correct form, and then he says what a certain lugha or a certain group of people would say to that. So I can send you the reference if you like, but for this, I think it's a very interesting example, but I don't think it's representative of the genre, or I'm not sure if you could find more.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have 5 more minutes to go with this panel, and we welcome anyone with the final questions, answers, like responses. Hany, do you have anything to add here?
I have 2 quick questions.
We should go ahead and end the meeting.
Yeah, one for Mehtap and a comment for Colinda, if there is a time. So Chris, your paper was brilliant. So to map this translation movements of the Quran into Latin, and how this translation moved a big movement of knowledge production about the relation between Quran and the Bible. So I can see also, I can trace the same points that have been raised before during the medieval time that still continue. So like speaking about the adaptation of the biblical stories into Quran, and even now with the discovery of ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamia and all these ancient societies, we learned that the biblical original stories, it's not even original, it was adaptations of more ancient narratives. So here I can see a cycle of human nature that also like to adapt and like reframe and reproduce, this is the word, reproduce similar concepts in a different ways and different language and also different frame. So I would like to, if you give more ideas about when the Quran translated to Latin, and they didn't call it, I'm sure it's different from now, because we have the knowledge of ancient cultures. So this is the question from Chris. The question for Mehtap, thank you so much. This is a brilliant paper, and it touched on many things related to how Balagha was attacked and also defended during 18th and 19th century, and it's very important. So to speak about adopting the French module in thinking, and this way also was kind of part of the Nahda. They speak about the Nahda in the Arab world, that when they colonized, so they speak about Nahda, for example, Middle East, when Napoleon came to Egypt and colonized Egypt. And they think that there is a break between the medieval time and the Mamluk period and things like that, which kind of not logical. So what do you think about like this big division between Fasaha and Bayan related to Quran, and how they continue teaching Quran in different Balagha system? So I know it's a difficult question, but once you adopt the French module or the other modules of thinking, and you depart the Quran from its Balagha frame, it can be tricky to understand, like rational questions about metaphors in Quran, for example. So if you speak about things like that, a balagha will treat it in a different way.
Yeah.
You got my point, Mehtap? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the comment for Colinda, yeah. And the comment for Colinda, you mentioned it's a brilliant paper. I really loved it as well. The thing I really loved also the way that you highlighted the Arabic terms and how they differentiated between mu'arrab or dakhil and this kind of term. And I was wondering if you digged deep enough in the term loanword itself when it was first introduced, because loanword is like, if we think about it, it's like you borrow a word and after that you give it back. So it should be like this. So it doesn't make any sense. Loanword, it's a weird. So if you have time, you just comment on this thing. So please, Chris, yeah, you go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, thank you. And I mean, that's such a great point you bring up about, how, when you really start looking, the biblical originals aren't even necessarily original. And, a criticism I could anticipate is like, well, if the Bible isn't the source, then what is? But I think, as you were saying, is that in the ancient Middle East, there were similar stories circulating. And part of, I guess, part of the reason, one of the things I wanted to emphasize, why of all the critics, why pick Bloom? Well, apart from his interest in Gnosticism, is that idea that, the whatever he calls it, there's a lot of problems with his term strong misreading, but at least he acknowledges that the originality is what we should be looking at and what we really ought to be doing, and not to dismiss comparative religion and, comparisons between the Bible and the Quran, because what my missing minute was going to do was give an ironic gesture to how important all that stuff is, but just that it's been overemphasized. So yeah, thank you. And then, I only was able to talk about the very first of the Latin translations of the Quran, but I've, been looking at several of them, up into the 18th century. And well, one of the things that up into about, the Baroque period and the Counter-Reformation and Reformation they do is, when there's a similarity between the Quran and the Bible, they say, well, the Quran was just, copying the Bible. And when there's not a similarity, like for instance, in the story of the prophet Salah, who doesn't appear in the Bible, it's like, well, they're just making stuff up. So it's like really damned if you do, damned if you don't in this approach. And I mean, also, there's been this emphasis lately in some trends of scholarship to say that the Enlightenment Quran started to view Islam more favorably. And that might be true, but I'll end now by just saying that there's a sinister undertone to it, because you would find George Sales, who also did a Qur'an translation heavily influenced by the existing Latin translations, who said the Arabs conquered so much territory. And, this is an 18th century English person saying this. We can learn from this culture, So yes, there's this more favorable view towards Islam, but there's also at the same time a tendency to appropriate it as a blueprint for imperialism. So thank you, and I'll let the other speakers, and thank you to the other panelists, and thank you, the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, for your great comments. It's actually an honor having you here, and other great speakers that really, I enjoyed. The thing is that I was very sick, but then I got very excited in the middle of the day, which means it was amazing. So thank you so much, everyone. And
Nasim, can you please let Mehtap and Colinda comment quickly. So
Oh,
it's,
sure, Mehtap and Colinda, please go
yes,
ahead.
please.
If you have any
Yeah,
comments.
Hi, so thank you for the question, and I must say it's a difficult question because the in what I have surveyed so far about the debates, the Quran did not come up as a text to be taught, at least for the teaching the rudimentaries of balagat or composition. Even for Haji Ibrahim Effendi, it held a an ideological significance, and it was a reference point. But even in the school he established, the Arabic private school, he chose other materials. The Quran was not part of the curriculum at all. And I must say, I haven't thought about, where Quran was taught in or used as a text for language education. I must, I have some homework to do on that, but thanks. But I can say that, for example, for Muallim Naji, Quran and the Quranic language was literal language, at least, because in his conversation with Bashir Fuad, and Bashir Fuad was a positivist thinker, and he was an atheist. And Bashir Fuad, for example, used the metaphor of nature as the book of God, in his discussions. And of course, the God was sort of withdrawn from his discourse later in the discussion, but it was still, as a metaphor there. And this shows us even someone who was not interested in Arabic or Persian, such metaphors or there wasn't available vocabulary to use. As for Muallim Naji, for example, the Quranic language, its rhetorical strength was really important, and especially for his thinking of poetry and poetic language, and sort of the connecting it to the creation of the man, and what allows us to become humans was the language itself, which was sort of crystallized in the Quran itself. So the Quran was like sort of a reference point for him to make a case on the necessity of balaghat and fasakhat at the same time. So, but yeah.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yes, I can respond very briefly. Thank you for your comment, Hany. And I totally agree with you that loanword or even lexical borrowing is a problematic term, and that's also acknowledged by modern linguists. And I think that the term taʿrīb captures so much better what's going on, because even if a word is not changed, it is incorporated into the Arabic language and it's made Arabic. But as Ibn Sarraj said, that this is a virtue of the Arabic language, that it can do such things as forming words like taʿrīb, and the reader or speaker knows exactly what is meant by it. And other languages probably don't have this virtue.
Yeah, I think this answer also touched on David Larsen book about Ibn Khalaway and 500 names of lion. I'm sure many of them have foreign origin. So I think we came to end. I have to thank Nasim Basiri for sharing the final session. I have also to thank the three brilliant papers that we concluded this session with. And yeah, so chapeau for all of you. You really made our days today very special. And we thank you all, and we hope you have a good, relaxing evening after a very productive day. Tomorrow we have the second keynote speaker is Michael Copperson, and we have a very special session as well. Before, I think 2 sessions before Michael, 2 sessions, yeah, before Michael lecture. So we hope to see you tomorrow. And we continue our discussion about the pre-modern Islamic multilingualism. Thank you all, and have a good, relaxing evening. Yeah.